Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by Jake Wieseneck, a principal at Maniv. Hi, Jake. How are you doing and where are you dialing in from?
Hey, Julian. Great to see you as always. Dialing in from our office here in Midtown Manhattan.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining the show. We always love to have Penn alumni on. It's great to sort of make it full circle and hear where they end up in their careers today. We're going to kind of start with some introductory questions to just understand who you are and what Maniv is. So, in simple terms, could you describe to me what Maniv is and what you guys do?
Yeah, more than happy to do so. And proud class of 2018 College of Arts and Sciences alum, and really happy to be here. So let's do it. What is a Maniv? What is Maniv? What do we do? We're an early stage venture capital fund headquartered in Tel Aviv with an office that I joined to help start about 4 years ago here in New York City. We invested seed and Series A in the deep technologies and business model innovation companies that are catalyzing the decarbonization and the digitization of the movement of people and the movement of goods. Suffice it to say, it's a hell of a lot more difficult to scale a startup these days when there's steel in the value chain in some way, shape, or form, moving people, moving goods, getting from here, there, and everywhere across this interconnected globe. And so from our point of view, our model is fully predicated on how can we help those brave entrepreneurs that are going out there and founding businesses with these physical assets involved in some way, shape, or form in their business model, and helping them generate product market fit as quickly and efficiently as possible, leveraging the network that we have at our disposal, which I'm more than happy to go into.
Great. Thank you so much for that. You mentioned that Maniv is headquartered in Tel Aviv, but you have an office in New
Sure.
York. Is there a particular geography or market that you guys tend to focus on, or is it really a global
You know,
lens for?
as we like to say, we invest as far as democracy travels. And I think one could even argue maybe that's become a little bit smaller since when I first joined the firm back in 2021. But politics aside, we are global investors. And maybe just to touch on one point I was alluding to earlier, we're lucky enough to be supported across our three funds by a wide range of limited partners, financial, institutional, and strategic in nature, that are spread across five different continents. And so as a result, much of our investing activity is predicated on our belief that in order to come up with the businesses that meet the needs of consumers and businesses of how people and goods move, one needs to take a global lens to what they're doing. So, a long winded way of saying about 80% of the capital that we deploy is going to be into businesses across US, Europe, and Israel, where our physical footprint maps to. But we've deployed about 20% of our capital into select emerging markets, including Mexico, Brazil, India, the GCC, based on a strong fundamental belief. And happy to go into this if we'd like, that a lot of the business models that come to be in more informal economies lend themselves to generate more flexible and agile, as particularly mobility services businesses, that those of us here in the Western world have tons to learn from, especially when we're thinking about lighter or different form factors than the traditional four-wheeled automobile, and also when we're thinking about shared ownership models in a variety of different shapes and sizes.
Totally. Definitely want to dive into that topic because I think it's super interesting. Before we get there, though, I have just to help the listeners understand. I think when a lot of people think about investing in the mobility space, they think of Uber, Lyft,
Sure.
a lot of your ride hailing, or maybe even like a DoorDash app. The world is like a lot broader than that particular sort of view into mobility. So maybe could you walk us through maybe what are some of your more exciting investments that you personally have been involved in, just to help paint the
Yeah.
picture a little bit more of what you guys actually invest in?
More than happy to do so. There's a reason that we define mobility as the cleaner, safer, more efficient, more accessible movement of people and goods. And implicit in that is a belief when I mentioned earlier that we're investing in the technologies that are enabling the decarbonization and digitization of the transportation world. That is not just necessarily what is the vehicle through which one travels, or how is that trip sold to an individual in order to move, or how does a package get from A to B in Manhattan or Philadelphia or Paris or Bangalore, any metropolis across the world. A lot of the investment activity that we do actually goes one level deeper and thinks about when we're looking towards how people and goods are going to move in 2030, 2040, 2050, and beyond. What are a lot of the we call first derivative bets, the picks and shovels, the baseline enabling technologies that are required for that vision of how people and goods move to materialize. So that includes, if we could talk about mobility in the traditional sense, just talking about some of the investments that I've been involved in over the last year. We recently closed a deal and announced formally an investment in partnership with our friends and limited partners over at Shell Ventures, the energy company, an investment company by the name of FreshBus that is a 100% digital and 100% asset heavy long haul bus line in southern India. They're headquartered down in Bangalore, and they are delivering airline style customer service to passengers looking to travel 5, 6, 7 hours on a bus, and all of which are brand new, beautiful EV buses going between cities like Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Chennai. And that's enabled, most importantly, by way of a very beneficial tax regime in the Indian ecosystem that makes on a per kilometer basis at about 25% cheaper to travel and operate a bus line that is 100% EV as compared to diesel incumbent, let alone a better, smoother, and much more environmentally friendly experience. Also serve on the board on the complete opposite side of the spectrum that is definitively counter to my international relations and Hispanic studies majors back in the college, serve on the board of one of our deep technology companies in the hydrogen space, a company by the name of Celadine Technologies that was spun out of Argonne National Lab, the DOE lab in Chicagoland, that essentially has developed a killer hack, which is a material science technology, a coating that goes inside a PEM membrane, which is a very critical component within a hydrogen fuel cell or an electrolyzer, essentially significantly reducing the cost of either storing and or using hydrogen in a transportation economy. And from our point of view, hey, if hydrogen is going to be a thing in transportation, we need to significantly reduce the cost curve. And Celadine, in their own right, has developed a real killer hack in that regard that we think makes the unit economics of hydrogen sustainable in the long term. So let those maybe be two examples of how wide-ranging the investment aperture could be. But I'll throw two in there maybe that are the most notable in the portfolio. Turo is a portfolio company from way back in the day. One of my managing partners' personal investments was in a company that was acquired by Turo over 10 years ago. And I am sure that's something that Wharton graduate students use, MBAs use when they travel across the country or across the globe and looking for cheap access to vehicles. And then in the New York-centric mind, Revel. Revel is a business that we seeded back when they were a moped company way back in the day and now have the leading DC fast charge, i.e., fast charge capable of charging a Tesla in 20 minutes or less network here in New York City, and a fleet of 500 going on 1,000 cars, delivering an Uber Lyft experience, 100% EV here in New York City and more cities to come. Went on a lot there. We can add, we can edit, we can change more names as you see fit.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. I think it was great to sort of paint a picture of where you guys really invest. I think now we're sort of like going to shift into the meat of the podcast. And there's three really themes that I want to dive into you with, Jake.
Sure.
And the first, I think, relates a little bit to that topic that you're bringing up in the beginning around sort of maybe investing in some of those emerging markets and the opportunities that those provide. And I think it's centered around this concept that more and more people are moving to urban centers. I think some of the expectations or estimates for 2030 is that 5 billion people, upwards of over half of the world population, will be living in an urban center. And that will fundamentally change the way people both move and maybe purchase assets in the transportation space. We talked about sort of shared mobility, but also people maybe moving from vehicles into scooters, electric bikes, any variety of smaller transportation. So curious to think, how is Maniv playing in that sector? What are the exciting sort of opportunities there? And are those shifts that you think are really going to be centralized in the emerging market? Or do you eventually see that perhaps even in the United States where the car is so beloved that people may be trading down into a cargo bike?
Happy to do so. Maybe I'll take a moment to share an anecdote that maybe explains a little bit more about our investment process and how our organization is set up that sheds light on this exact theme and gets at how we've invested behind this trend. Maniv is an organization, like I mentioned earlier, we're lucky enough to work with now across our three funds over 25 different corporate strategic limited partners who, in addition to some of the world's leading sovereign wealth funds, banks, and insurance groups, support our funds and really are strategic thought partners in terms of what the future of the mobility sector is going to look like. And most importantly, the technologies that are going to be essential if you are Toyota, Hyundai, Jaguar Land Rover, BMW, and what's going to be built in-house. And most importantly, what are some of the technologies they're looking to partner with others on? And so Maniv, our first fund back in 2017, 2018, was really concentrated in its investment activity, primarily at the intersection of technology within the car, many of which was related to autonomy, a topic I know that we'll spend some time on in a bit, but also tied to the Israeli ecosystem in particular. And as we were preparing to go to market for our fund too, with the thesis around investing a little bit more globally in all of the opportunities that are happening in this real boom of technology in and around the mobility sector in the late 2010s and the early 2020s, I hark back to one anecdote that my team was spending time with an executive, an automotive executive at one of our limited partners, who essentially said, hey, our aperture in terms of what's of interest to our team, this group happened to be an OEM based over in Asia, one should think of our interest areas from a technology point of view, not just on the technology that rests within the car, but as the car, the personal automobile becomes even further decoupled. And you think about what are the opportunities for that vehicle trip to become not just one getting in their car and driving to the grocery store, but thinking about all the different ways that you can get to the grocery store and grocery can get back to you. You could take a scooter. You could have an app that routes you via public transit. You could actually not even go to the grocery store and have those groceries to be delivered to you. Where those groceries could be delivered to you by a truck, by a cargo bike, by someone else who's a courier that might be on their scooter in their own right, maybe even one day by a drone. That whole remit is the sorts of things that are of interest for automotive OEMs in some way, shape, or form today as they think about their license to play and also how their own businesses in their own right are being disrupted. And so we have the benefit of learning from all of these folks and thinking with them about what the future of the car is, what's one's association with the car. But even more interesting, Julian, how all the technology that was developed for the personal automobile can be decoupled and put into all different modes of transit that create a lot of interesting opportunities for technologists to go after. It gets us to this point, which was the original source of the question, which is how is transportation within an urban center going to change? And what I would think position folks to think about is an economy that's not just oriented towards here is a vehicle and I own that vehicle and that vehicle is how I get from A to B, but think about oneself in what we like to call the trip economy. One purchase is a trip is an experience, just like a concert ticket or a baseball game ticket is an experience you have at a given point in time. And you're looking for something in particular when you're making that purchase for a one-time event. The same can be thought of in our urban centers today. And I think it is very fair to say that in emerging markets, there's long been a more informal economy in terms of what that looks like. Informal van pooling in Southeast Asian markets, for example, tuk-tuk hailing and the like, and all the opportunities that come from that. And I think we're starting to see that electrification is becoming the impetus for a lot more new vehicles to be built and become commonplace, not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world as well, that are going to lead us more towards, hey, a scooter might be the best way to get here, or a shared Uber might be the best way to get there, or this is a personal Uber trip that I need to take for one reason or the next, or you know what? There's a bus that's going right up Walnut, and I'm going to take that bus all the way to class because it's actually going to be the quickest and most efficient and cost-effective way to get there. So experience one's comfort, which I think is also something to really think about because, hey, for better or for worse, I'm personally someone who's not going to trust myself or the drivers around me getting on a scooter, especially in a big city. And time are going to be the vectors on which a lot of these decisions are going to be made, not just when they walk into a dealership and say, hey, am I buying an SUV or am I buying a car for me and my family?
Yeah, that's a great overview. And I think your last point is particularly telling, at least, and maybe a concern of mine in terms of this adoption of smaller, different modes or forms of transit in the US is transportation is ultimately, in a large part, an emotional part, right? I think maybe this is a very US thing. It's the freedom to go wherever I want to go, when I want to go in my own car. Do you think, is it going to be regulation or is it just ultimately going to be convenience and affordability of these other forms of transit that will push people in America to them? Because right now, I just don't, as quickly and as rapidly as those shifts are happening, maybe in other emerging markets, it just doesn't necessarily seem like that same rate of change is actually happening in the US.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And we talked about maybe Southeast Asia and some of the more developing world in that regard. I want to give Europe their flowers here for a moment because they really deserve it. Because when you think about cities like Paris, which is having a great moment on the back of the Olympic Games this summer, one of the other things that Paris has been so applauded for is many of the policies that they put in place to become car free. But to become car free in certain aspects, in certain zones within a city, there is a very significant infrastructure investment that's going to be required. And yes, we can talk about public transit in a lot of ways. And I think if you want to know where I'm getting to, that's the biggest thing that makes it very, very difficult to think about viable transportation alternatives away from the car. American urban centers. For a second, I really want to talk about what actually happens on the street level. And what I'm really referring to is significant investment and prioritization of bike lanes, and particularly protected bike lanes, as being something that is so essential in order for there to be viable alternatives. And so, what does it take for something like protected bike lanes to be built? Alignment between a lot of stakeholders within city governments, bike sharing platforms that make bikes affordable, easy, and accessible. Things like Philadelphia has done quite well. New York has done quite well. They're not quite there on the bike lane point of view, but we can get there over time. And on that point, also thinking about from a safety point of view, realizing that bikers or those that are taking alternative modes of micromobility are not necessarily just free riders who can do whatever they want in those lanes. Hey, there's still rules of the road that need to be abided, traffic signs and stoplights and the like that need to be considered. These are the sorts of mindset shifts that I would argue just are not present in the United States at this point in time. You go to Copenhagen, you're going to have the most obedient audience that not only can get around the city like that by way of their bike, they're going to stop at the stoplights, they're going to cross where appropriate, and they're going to stay within those lanes. So that's one mindset shift within the individual that is essential. The second is a policy prioritization of taking cars off the streets and building the physical protected infrastructure that's required. And then the third, which is definitively on the wish list for those here in the States, is mass transit in the form of clean, efficient buses and even more underground subways and transit systems that match what our peers in Europe, and I would even argue our peers in Southeast Asia. Go to Bangalore and Hyderabad and you will be amazed by the metro systems that exist in those cities, even though they're mostly built in the air as compared to in the ground. Those are the sorts of things that are essential, and alignment on those all as common good priorities are required for us to even begin talking about taking the car out of urban centers here in America.
Don't forget about micromobility and vans, Jake. As an ex-Via employee, I have to harp on that.
Look, I was out in Queens this past weekend, and Lime and Bird are back anew. Let's take a look at the market cap of some of those companies before we talk about their long-term viability. But look, I agree with you completely. And I think one thing that's going to emerge as well, and this is something that's quite interesting and folks should take note of, is the fact that from a large employer point of view, mobility and transportation services of benefit is something that's becoming an expectation. And in different economies, what that actually means is quite different. So I'll give you an example from the portfolio. I serve on the board of a company by the name of Colors, Kolors, based down in Mexico. And half of their business is operating long haul buses up to 18-hour trips between different metropolises down in Mexico. The other half of their business is actually doing what's called B2B employee transport. And what they're doing is they are transporting, for example, tens of thousands of Amazon employees door to door across 18 different cities last time I checked in Mexico, because the expectation down there is if you're working for someone like an Amazon or someone like a PepsiCo or someone like a Heineken, all of whom are Colors clients today, you're going to be provided door to door transport. In the United States and in Europe, oftentimes WageWorks is the traditional paradigm that we think about. You get your WageWorks card and you can go and buy some parking or buy a Metro card here in New York City. A lot of times now, those sorts of things are being disintermediated, and one is being provided with flexible mobility benefits or the opportunity to purchase an e-bike. In Europe, it's often a standard that one's provided with a car if they have a job of a certain degree within a large corporation as a benefit as well. And a lot of folks don't want that car anymore. They want a cargo bike. They want a scooter. They want a moped, whatever it might be. And seeing the business opportunities that emerge around that's something really interesting for us to see at seed stage, and how that maps to the changing in consumer preferences around ownership, particularly in urban centers.
I think there's going to be another interesting question that I want to ask this, but I want to get to the next topic first, and then I'll ask the question sort of
Sure.
as an overarching for both, but wanted to shift gears into sort of autonomy and the adoption of autonomy. The news cycle, I think, in the past 12 to 24 months has had its highs and lows with high-profile incidents and accidents with Waymo vehicles and cruise vehicles, or cruise even shutting down. I know Maniv has a couple investments more in sort of the supply chain, I would say, of autonomy in terms of sensor suite software companies that support a lot of the autonomous vehicles. Are you guys still sort of feeling bullish on the sector and just believing that eventually we're going to get to a point where autonomy is good enough to, whether it's maybe not full autonomy for all cars on the road in the markets, at least autonomy for certain functions, or is the mood kind of soured altogether on autonomy?
Yeah, great question. I want to give two learnings that have come out from the autonomous cycle and maybe what I'd call the pushing out of some of the timelines and consumer expectations for when we're going to be running around our cities in robo-taxis for a second, and maybe just comment on what you mentioned in terms of the portfolio, because I think autonomy is a really interesting case study of why it is that it's so important for founders, especially in seed stage businesses, to be quite agile. So what I would comment on and say is that in our portfolio, Julian, you're completely right, especially in our fund one, a lot of our investments that we made back in 2017, 2018, my partners, a lot of those investments were predicated on a belief that the 2020s were going to be a decade of full personal autonomy. That clearly has not materialized. It's taught us a very important lesson from founders whose businesses mainly were predicated on that, and the importance of being agile, harnessing the assets that a business has, and refocusing one's go to market in nearer term commercial opportunities to keep businesses afloat, which is the name of the game in a world that we would almost call riverboat gambling, where 18, 24 months, you got to prove what you're doing for the next capital infusion, or else pack up your bags and do something else. And so in our portfolio, I think one thing that we've noticed is that a lot of the founders that we initially invested in under a thesis of autonomy have found ways to refocus their businesses on nearer term technology opportunities and near term business opportunities to commercialize what it is they're doing in a different light. I'll pick on, for example, the most valuable portfolio company that we have from a Mark's point of view, which is come by the name of Halo, based over in Tel Aviv. They are semiconductor company. They are building a chipset that was particularly focused on an autonomous vehicle use case. Low power requirements, incredibly high compute, perfect for powering an autonomous vehicle. That's clearly not materialized, and the intermediary have pivoted into focusing on a number of other markets, from security cameras to televisions to a variety of other high compute requirement devices, while there still is definitively a pipeline for them to go to market in autonomy, and they're working with a lot of the players that matter out there. This is just, I think, a really important lesson when one is building a business based on a speculative idea. It's really important to think about what are the different downside or alternative go-to-market options that exist. And that's one thing that we've really learned as investors in the field. Now, let me answer your question about autonomy directly with that preface aside. Our point of view is autonomy is not a technology problem. The technology is there in a lot of ways, and just go spend some time with folks at Waymo, Cruise, Zoox, to name a few, which we have, let alone Kodiak and Aurora and what they're doing in trucking. We'll come back to trucking in a second. The technology is there from a lot of points of view. Whether or not we're going to get to full autonomy in our lifetimes, I really think is more a question of politics and the human psyche. Think about it and just how many accidents occur on our roads day in, day out when there are human drivers out there, and the fact that it is a hell of a lot more dangerous to get in your car and drive a few blocks in any city as it is to take a transatlantic or trans-Pacific flight these days. There is a real tolerance for error that is accepted when humans are in control and at the wheel. That being said, when that same right and agency over controlling the steering wheel is passed over to technology, computers, or whatever they might be, that same level of acceptance for the inherent risk of driving goes out the window, and it's really become a zero-sum game, for better or for worse. So I would posit that whether or not we're going to get there on autonomy is more a question of policy and of the human psyche than it is of technology. And if you're interested more on this topic, one of our partners and close friends, a gentleman by the name of Jeff Brandes, the Honorable Jeff Brandes, he just finished 10 years in the Florida legislature, where he was actually responsible for writing a lot of the legislation that's become the template that was written in Florida and been adopted in states like Arizona and California, that lays out how we square the circle between the need to govern our society and set the restrictions and regulations of autonomous technology, and the desire inherently to get that on the road from some corporations that have great pathways to commercialize that, and let some of the Uber announcements with some of the autonomous providers over the course of the past week be evidence that from a business point of view, this still remains very front of line. But I think this is a psychology question and a politics question a lot more than it is for a technology question. Now, I'm going to add one more point. I think there's one other really interesting thing from autonomy that we've been thinking a lot about, and that is the fact that for our engineering friends that are out there, there is a desire for engineers, for very, very good reason, to work on a problem that has application in the real world in the near term. And one of the things that we have observed is that there's been a real flight of great technologists from the Cruises of the world, the Waymos of the world, and the Zooxes of the world to more agile startups that provide a nearer term opportunity, given what we just discussed in terms of the longer term timelines for the robotaxi business model to become fully disseminated, to find nearer term ways to commercialize the technology that's been developed in what I would sometimes call the learning laboratories of organizations that are Waymo, Cruise, and some of the other autonomy providers, and think about ways to commercialize it. And a lot of those are in closed loop systems. And given a lot of what's happening in the news these days, particularly around the increase of warehouse labor and manufacturing jobs in a lot of ways which are becoming a lot less appealing here in the United States, there's a lot of great businesses that are leveraging some of the computer vision technology that's been developed within the autonomy companies and commercializing that in a variety of robotics applications on the warehouse floor, on the manufacturing floor. And I think that's one trend that we're very keenly observing here at Maniv, and how a lot of the technologies that might have been originally developed for a robotaxi might very well find themselves helping packages or build consumer electronics or vehicles on a manufacturing assembly line.
Yeah. So that kind of is like a tangent to a follow-up question that I wanted to ask is that, I think a lot of times there's other applications to autonomy. So glad you addressed that. Put a bow on sort of the first two topics that we talked about is in both cases, regulation and sort of political willpower and policy all sort of were intermingled with the business opportunities at hand. Autonomy is maybe there right now for us to have robo-taxis, but it's really the policy holding it back. So curious how you guys think from a business perspective about underwriting maybe some of this regulatory risk or pricing it into the ultimate sort of exits or revenue of the companies that you invest in, because in some sense it's quite hard to actually model or hard to predict how the regulatory environment will change.
Yeah, hey, if you have a secret guide on how to do so and what that price quotient is, let me know, because we're still looking for it. No, in all seriousness, Julian, I mean, this is one of the most important things to think about. And you asked a question under the guise of autonomy, but I'll also flag in the world of electrification. For better or for worse, electric vehicle adoption and policy to promote it, at least in the United States, has become a really partisan topic. And I bring that up to say that when we think about underwriting an investment, a lot of what we think about, for example, is there a regulatory environment out there? I'll talk about subsidies for a second, a subsidy environment that is out there that can give the company in its early innings the opportunity to get to critical mass, get to scale where what they're doing becomes interesting, and get to a point where they can be unit economic positive without those subsidies, without that regulation that aids them. And that's a lot of the calculus that we're doing, especially when we think about electric vehicle OEMs or operators like FreshBus, who I alluded to, who's benefiting from many of the opportunities and pro-EV policies that exist in India. Let's take that, let's extrapolate that to autonomy. A lot of the question becomes, can the company succeed and get enough rides or hours in market while there is a policy framework that is favorable towards what it is they are doing, in order to reach a critical density where they have the trust of the public in order to do so? I would argue that's a lot of what's happening in the world of EVs. Our governments are subsidizing EVs because they believe inherently it benefits us from a material supply chain point of view, but also from an emissions point of view, to have more EVs on the roads. And those subsidies are going to exist for a period of time until there's critical mass that is the case. And so from our point of view, when we think about underwriting businesses with some form of regulatory risk, the question is, can the business succeed without a given regulation, subsidy, whatever it might be? And do they have enough opportunity within the venture timelines and also just the business timelines that they have to prove the safety, security, or the worthwhile consumer adoption of whatever it is that business is doing, whether it be selling electric cars or whether it be trusting people to get in the backseat of a driverless vehicle, and most importantly, be comfortable driving on the roads alongside a driverless vehicle, which is the bigger question here, succeed in those timelines, and then in turn, get the support of the general public behind what they're doing and the invisible hand of the market moving consumers in that direction.
Final topic that I really wanted to address, and again, alluded to it in the beginning of the podcast or beginning of the interview, is around Maniv is ultimately investing in companies that are building physical assets and products that require a lot of steel, factories, and a lot more capital intensive items than just spinning up a software company with a couple of engineers.
Sure.
And given this may be again changing in the months to come, but the last year and a half, 2 years has been in a much more tight interest rate environment than previously, which has made it potentially maybe more challenging to fund those businesses. I've heard two
Hmm.
takes on this. One is that it's for hardware intensive businesses and it's much more challenging. There's just less capital to go
Hmm.
around to fund these bigger projects. But on the flip side, and this is probably true for all businesses, it makes people build more efficient businesses and it's actually potentially healthy for the industry. Given, and that may be more of a software centric view on the matter, but given that you
Hmm.
guys invest in sort of both areas, curious for your take on that and how sort of like the different environment in the last 2 years has maybe either been good for businesses or definitely more of a challenge.
Yeah, so I agree with both of the points that you raised as being fact in my mind. It is more challenging than ever to raise venture capital. It is more challenging as a hardware business to raise venture capital as compared to as a software asset light, higher margin business. And I would also agree that the last 2 years have led to a situation where the expectations put on founders are higher than ever before. And most importantly, that just places a premium on the entrepreneur and their ability to be agile. I was speaking a little bit earlier about some of our portfolio companies that built a business model based on an anticipated adoption of autonomy that just did not pan out. And the best founders are those that are able to pivot, understand what their core assets are, and find ways to monetize them, even in the absence of a baseline expectation materializing in how they anticipated. What does it look like kind of today in the funding environment? There is almost an unfair expectation that's being placed on founders that they're able to be agile enough to raise their seed round and reach cash flow break even if necessary, just on potentially the $4 to $5 million that they might raise at seed, which by the way are larger seed rounds than might have been the expectation 7 to 10 years ago as well in their own right. And so from the Maniv point of view, this above all else places a emphasis on two things. The first is we in venture capital are in a people business. We are investing in the people that not only have great ideas that when successful represent potential billion-dollar outcomes from a venture return point of view. You don't keep a top decile fund if you don't continue to place that as your number one goal above all else. That being said, the second expectation on that is that that founder is going to be an individual who is able to roll with the punches that are thrown their way. And when plan A doesn't work, plan B or plan C or plan D, also in their own right, represent potential billion-dollar outcomes. What does that look like in practice and how do we think about that? Our organization and DNA is really oriented towards, and this might be a little bit of the Israeli perspective that we bring to the table, where one of the languages that we speak above all else is the language of the pre-mortem. Whenever we are evaluating an investment ourselves, and then when we get deep in diligence with founders, we are pre-morteming the business together and walking through if the company fails, what are all the reasons why the company can fail? And thinking through when those potential blocks in the road emerge, how can you find ways to kind of pivot off of them, do a spin move, and move yourself in a different direction? And we want to make sure that we're working with founders that not only first and foremost are able to think creatively about what those opportunities are, but also in turn want to work with supportive investors who, above all else, are ready to roll up their sleeves, get behind a whiteboard, and think through those sorts of things together. Those are the sorts of people that we intend to work with. And I would argue the sorts of founders that are going to continue to persist and succeed in this sort of environment because everything is not what it seems, and everything is definitively not going to be the hockey stick growth curve that's on page 13 of your 15-page seed stage pitch deck. Spending time with the people that are able to kind of will their businesses into existence, those are the founders that are continuing to succeed, and they're going to succeed irrespective of the funding environment, no matter how difficult it might be. And those are the sorts of founders that we're here to support.
Awesome. It's a great answer. So VC is a notoriously difficult industry to get into. Do you have any sort of advice for people looking to get into VC generally or people looking specifically to get into VC in the mobility space? Either works.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do so. Let's talk about the second point first in terms of VC in the mobility space. I find myself incredibly lucky. I've been a planes, trains, and automobiles kid my entire life, and having the chance to marry kind of what I like to say, what I Google in my spare time with what I get to do day in, day out means get to have a ton of fun. And so if you're particularly passionate about a given space and have an opportunity to find like-minded people, they will want to talk to you. That passion will come through. That was lucky to be the case for myself and Maniv, and I would encourage folks to leverage the Wharton network, to leverage what other networks you're a part of, and find people in your affinity area, whether it be mobility, whether it be climate, whether it be fashion, whatever it might be. finding people in that space. They love speaking to like-minded people, and that passion really shows. I can know that's the case when we speak to people who like to grind their gears in the transportation sector and the decarbonization of it as much as we do. So that's point number one. Around the VC space more broadly, I think the number one piece of advice I would give is that the traditional path does not necessarily equal the most straightforward line into VC. And what I mean by that in particular, and this is maybe a piece of more general career advice as well, sometimes it's what you do that's a little bit different, or the areas of expertise or specialization that you can garner that might be different than the traditional 2, 3, 4, 5 year progression path that's expected to be the stereotypical way into the industry, often is what makes the resume pop a little bit more and gets folks that are in a position of hiring of greater interest. It's very purposeful that our team at Maniv is broad in terms of the backgrounds that we look for. Me and my three partners, we all very purposefully come from different backgrounds. And that's the group that we've looked to bring together to make sure that we have the greatest diversity of opinion and ideas when we debate an investment opportunity or the like. And so this is my way of saying banking, consulting is not necessarily the one way into VC growth, private equity, et cetera. Spending time at a startup, doing something a little bit more different in terms of an operating role, or even if you were in the investment space, getting some different expertise, maybe in fundraising, maybe even in database management, which is relevant for managing pipeline. Think about the sorts of things that separate your experience and expertise from others. And more often than not, those are the folks that might pique someone with a little interest a little bit greater. So don't shy away from those opportunities, even if they aren't the typically clear and direct path towards your goals.
Awesome. That's an absolutely great answer. And I think is definitely true from a lot of people is that regardless of the industry, I think you're best off when you ultimately follow your passion because you love what you do and bring that energy every single day. So love to hear that advice and it still applies for VC.
100%. Julien, thanks a ton for the time. A lot of fun discussing as always.
No worries. Thank you. Cheers.